This is episode 3, entitled Work. A doctor in the hospital ER. The usual morbid stuff. Hello world, welcome to the show. We work, rest and play. This is where we dissect, decipher and demystify people's work and their lives outside of work. I'm Dan, your host, and welcome to episode 3. In this episode, we are talking work, where we go deep and get real about what it's actually like to work as a doctor in the emergency department of a hospital. And yes, it was sad to say goodbye to Dennis in episode 2, but I'm very happy to introduce a new guest to the show, and her name is Sunny, who I've known for a very long time also. In fact, I've known her ever since primary school or elementary school, depending on what part of the world you're from. And she also happens to be the wife of our first guest, Dennis. And she too was super gracious with her time. And once again, these episodes are absolutely chock full of info. So for work, Sunny is a doctor, specifically an emergency specialist, who currently works in a couple of the major hospitals in Sydney, Australia, in the emergency department, perhaps better known as the ER section of the hospital. She has over 12 years of experience in the industry and gives us a real-life look into what it's like to be a doctor in this area, and she is a wealth of knowledge with heaps of advice and lots of insight. As there was so much to talk about, we will have 3 episodes in total with Sunny, the first 2 about work and the third on rest and play. In this specific episode, we dive into things like, what is an emergency specialist? We decipher what is meant by the terms intern, resident, and registrar, which all equated to blah 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 to me before. What a typical day is like for an emergency specialist. We touch on some of the crazy, morbid stuff she sees on a day-to-day basis. We go deep into the sadder but necessary side of dealing with patient deaths, and more. You can see we cover a wide spectrum of topics, some of it very deep and meaningful. So I hope that has whet your appetite. So here we go. Please feel free to listen to episode 3. Please enjoy. So yes, you are a doctor, and of course you talk to 10 kids and you asked 10 kids, what do you want to do when you grow up? And more than half will probably say doctor. And I think it's very appropriate that I got a doctor in here early on. Now, Sunny's not just your typical doctor that, or for most of us, we're probably thinking about the family doctor, but you called yourself an emergency specialist.
Yeah.
What does that actually mean?
So in the field of doctors, there's a lot of different specialties. So the family doctor you go see when you have a cold is the general practitioner. Mm-hmm. That's a specialty in itself.
Right.
So our specialty is basically if you call an ambulance or you have some other emergency and you turn up to the hospital emergency department, we look after that.
So basically it's ER.
Yeah. As much as Neighbours is like your real neighbourhood house, you know. Yeah.
For those who are listening, Neighbours in Australia was a very. Neighbours is a very, I think, Australian British popular. Actually, it's Australian.
It's an Australian show about a street in Melbourne and all the houses and families that live there.
That's right.
It's basically a soap opera.
It is. Yes. Hence the analogy there. Actually, what does ER even stand for?
Emergency room.
I knew that.
I think in America that's what they call it.
Emergency room. Right.
In Australia, if you care, it's called ED, Emergency Department.
Oh, there you go. That I did not know. I thought it was ER everywhere. But so ER in Australia is ED, Emergency Department. And that's where we all go when there is, if you, for whatever reason, you're in an ambulance, the sirens are going off, they pick you up from the accident scene and you're in ED.
Yeah.
And that's where you work.
Yeah.
And so basically, which is ER, but it's not as dramatic as what the scene would do. Right, okay.
Less George Clooney's, unfortunately.
Right, but I mean, So I've got like a million questions about this, and I'm sure listeners do too. So let's see. Let's take one at a time. So, of course, it's not as dramatic as what we may see in television, but it's got to be pretty full on a lot of the time. Yeah.
Yeah, it certainly can be. There's lots of different hospitals in Sydney. Sydney, for those who don't know, is still a growing population. So the hospitals have kind of popped up as the population's grown a lot of the time, and so they're not really mapped out the way that you would think matches what is currently the population. So there's a lot of grouping of hospitals in the city area where the most of the population was before. And then as you go out west, as the population's been growing, there's not as many. So there's small hospitals and big hospitals, and depending on which hospital you're in, you'll get a different variety of people coming in through the door.
Right.
So emergency specialists in general will work in the emergency department. That's their sort of main line. There's other stuff that they can do as well. So one of the other things is doing retrieval, so being the helicopter doctor.
I was going to ask you about that, yep.
Yep, and there are specialists who do more than one specialty, so they'll do emergency and other things. You can, in terms of, for me, I work at two different hospitals, one smaller, one larger. So in the large tertiary hospitals, you will see everything from like children to car accidents to heart attacks to whatever. But they have a system in Sydney where if it's a small emergency department, they will try and divert things like major traumas to hospitals that are equipped to deal with them. So yeah, you see different things depending on where you are.
You mentioned tertiary hospital. What do you mean by tertiary in that sense?
So stupid medical lingo for everything.
Yeah.
But basically, it's the level of referral that you've got. So if you're at, we call the sort of general practitioner level, your primary healthcare, so it's your first contact.
Right, yep.
Yeah. And then they, if the GP feels that you need to have something done in hospital, then you go to a hospital. But then out of the hospitals, there are smaller hospitals, which may not have all the different specialties. And a tertiary referral centre in Sydney refers to a hospital that has actually all the different specialties. So the other smaller hospitals within the network will refer to them.
Oh, okay. So for those of us who are in Sydney, apologies for those who are not, but what are there, like you said, like a handful of tertiary hospitals?
Yeah, there's a handful.
Oh, can I ask which ones they are?
So Westmead would be one, RPA, Prince of Wales, Royal North Shore, Liverpool, and to some degree Nepean and St Vincent's.
Yep. Oh wow! I just assumed that all hospitals were the same, and they just happen to be bigger or smaller, or whatever.
Well, being that not every person that comes to hospital is going to need to have, for example, brain surgery.
Yes.
You'd have to go to a tertiary centre if you wanted that kind of specialty level. Yeah.
Okay. Because, I mean, most of us lay people will talk amongst each other, and in our somewhat, I don't know, relatively ignorant perspective, I guess, collectively, some will often say, some hospitals have better doctors as opposed to other hospitals. So don't go to that hospital, go to this one.
Yeah.
I guess that some of the basis of that is the fact that I'm guessing that you will have more experienced doctors in your tertiary hospitals. Is that necessarily the case?
Not necessarily, but but if you're in a small hospital and they find out that you have a certain specific kind of problem, they might need to transfer you to a bigger hospital. Or if you become very sick and your small hospital doesn't have, for example, like an intensive care unit, you might be transferred. So, and there's obviously going to be varying degrees of staffing. So I mean, I can't speak for everything, but I do find that if it is a hospital that is less well staffed, people tend to speak negatively of it.
Right.
Even if they've gotten, everything that they need to get. But it's just, if there's one nurse to the entire ward of people or one doctor to the entire hospital or something versus a bigger hospital where there'd be more staffing. Yeah.
Now, according to the media in Australia anyway, my understanding is that we're understaffed pretty much across the board when it comes to hospitals. Would you say that's the case? Or?
Yeah, probably.
Pretty much, yeah. Because, you hear about, all those people going to ED, I won't call it ER, and they have to wait for hours to get to. Obviously, so how does that typically work? So someone walks in and there's blood gushing out of their stomach, right? So I'm guessing, is there some sort of triage that happens? So as soon as they come in, they get looked at, and then it's a decision's made, okay, you're going to be looked at straight away, or you can wait a few hours?
Basically, there's one or a set of triage nurses who will look at everybody who comes in, ask them the few basic questions of, why you're here and that sort of thing. And there's a system of triage. So we actually have a number system in Australia of 1 to 5.
Right.
To see how urgently that they need to be seen from a medical point of view.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. We'll get into sort of what you do on a day-to-day basis shortly, but I just want to take a step back. And you mentioned that your I'm going to call it title is actually, so you're a qualified doctor and you specialize. Your specialty is an emergency specialist.
Yeah.
So when we're talking specialty, I guess your specialty could be pediatrics.
Yeah.
It could be, I don't even know.
Cardiology, neurosurgery,
all that. And emergency specialist is one of those.
Them,
and general practice, as in your family doctor, is also one of those specialties. Yeah. Right. So in fact, which I didn't know. I actually thought the family doctor was your default basic degree. And then you move on. But in fact, that's a specialty as well. Right.
Nowadays, anyone who's a GP will have gone through specialty general practice training.
Right.
Back in the day, basically you could be a GP as soon as you've graduated from university.
Yeah.
So, that thinking is from the old system.
Right. So is there any type of doctor you can be? So once you've done your basic degree, we'll get into the degree details a little bit later, but once you've graduated, to do anything as a qualified doctor, do you have to specialize in one of those things, or is there an occupation that you can do that's not a specialty?
There is. Yeah. So career medical officers is kind of what they call people who didn't go into a specialty, and so these people work as the generalist hospital staff in emergencies or on the wards. Under the supervision of specialists usually, yeah. And
that can be in any area within the hospital?
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
So these people won't be the ones who, do the operations and that sort of thing. So surgeons and people who are doing interventions and like that will have to be in specialty training.
Okay. And do the majority do that type of thing, or do the majority end up specialising?
The majority end up specialising, yeah.
Because I understand any type of specialty is another few years of a crap load of study.
So basically, there's no avoiding the crap load of study. Once you graduate, basically before you even enter any kind of training, you go through internship and residency, which is in Sydney attached to public hospitals, and so it is a training position where the junior doctors work in teams under the supervision of specialists. And then if they decide to go into specialty, they do so. And if they decide not to, then they become career medical officers and sort of continue the kind of work that they did as residents throughout the hospital and in the emergency department, wherever.
Okay, so let's go through those terms, because they always confuse the hell out of me because I know we've got a few friends who have done medicine, and you might come on and I'm hearing residency or residents, interns, registrars, and I'm like, okay, mine's going blank. I have no idea what they're talking about. So what's the sequence? So you've graduated from uni.
Okay.
Then what's the first step?
To add to the confusion, it's actually called different things depending on which country you're going.
Of course.
Yes.
Of course.
So
Yeah. Otherwise it'd be too easy.
we often find it confusing when we're talking to or reading about American things because what we call registrar, they call resident, and it's all just, yeah. Anyway.
Okay. So let's go Australia.
Yeah.
And then do you know the corresponding US titles as well?
Sort of.
Okay. Let's try that.
I think everybody calls intern.
Okay.
So that's first year.
So that's first year outside of first year in hospital.
Yeah.
Okay.
So first year as an actual doctor.
Yep.
And once you graduate, you are called Dr. blah, blah, blah.
Yep.
And you become an intern and you know nothing. And you wander around the hospital looking scared.
Yep.
And I think every country calls them interns.
Cool.
Yep. And after that, in Australia, you have residency. So you are called a resident.
Yep.
For a year.
Mm-hmm.
And then the year after that, if you continue to take resident jobs. So some of them are jobs attached to the job that you take.
Yep.
You become a senior resident.
Mm-hmm.
Then you become a registrar.
So senior resident, is that in the year after you're resident?
Yeah.
And then
Usually.
registrar is after senior resident? Or?
Yeah. Usually you become a registrar when you take a job that is a registrar. See, this is the problem. All the different specialties have their own way of judging how a trainee is making their way through the system.
Right.
So the titles that I'm giving you are basically attached to jobs.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you can be a registrar for many years. You could be a junior registrar, you can be a senior registrar, as you progress through whichever training program that you've decided.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't necessarily reflect how many years you've been a doctor or...
Okay.
Yeah. So after being a registrar, there's certain specialties which will have fellowships.
Mm-hmm.
So that's pretty much when you've done all the exam sort of stuff that requires you to become a specialist. And
so you're talking about the specialist as in cardiologist?
Yeah,
that type of
whatever specialist that you're going to. And you basically spend a year working as a fellow, where you are not fully given the rights of a specialist yet, but you've passed all your exams and things. Mm-hmm. And then you're a specialist.
Great. So it's like a year's practical experience before you actually... Right. So you've done all the exams, but you got to apply it first for you. So then after that 1 year's practice, is that you're guaranteed in, or do you have to sit another exam after that?
No, most fellowships, that's it. It's actually, you've done it all, and it's a experience here.
Well, okay, wow. Finally, it's all cleared up. So first year is intern, second year is resident, then senior resident. And then I guess once you hit registrar, it's like they've got about 3 or 4 years under the belt, and after that they're essentially an experienced doctor. Yeah. Depending on their
within the hospital framework, a registrar would be a senior doctor.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Cool. And then the career medical officer.
They would do internship, residency, possibly senior resident, and then move on to being a career medical officer.
So is that the same as a registrar?
Sort of. I guess it just depends on what kind of job they take up.
Okay. Yeah. But it's sort of like once they hit career medical officer, they're sort of quote unquote on par with registrar. Is it the same sort of type of role? But
because career medical officer can encompass anyone who's just become one after their residency through to someone who's been a career medical officer for 20 years, it doesn't actually reflect their experience.
Gotcha. And if I went to hospital and I was being looked after by a career medical officer, do they call themselves career medical officer, or is it just doctor whatever?
Because obviously these are really confusing terms of the specialties of different things. When we address people, the public, like people, people generally just tend to give their name or say doctor something.
Right.
Because it just makes things simpler.
Right. No, because the reason I ask is, for some reason, intern, resident and registrar is, I think I hear them whenever I'm in hospital quite often, but I've never actually heard career medical officer.
Yeah, so, I don't think anyone outside of medicine would be expected to understand what that means. Cool. So I don't think I'd ever introduce myself that way.
And you also mentioned, I'm just taking another step back here, when in your area in emergency, you have some doctors who do emergency plus other things. What do you mean by other things? Do they have dual specialties? Or?
Yeah. So there are people who can do emergency / pediatrics.
Isn't that like double the...
Double the exams.
Okay.
Double the process.
I'm struggling to even comprehend that workload, but we'll come to that. We'll come to that because seriously, the amount of study that these guys have, I mean, of course they got into medicine, so, you know, they're obviously very
Crazy
smart.
to begin with.
Yeah. but we'll come to that. Wow. Okay. So that's Australia. With America, many of us are very keen because a lot of us watch American television and stuff. Me, not so much, but I'm sure a lot of people do. So what's the rough sort of correlation? An intern in Australia?
As I understand it, although I'm not sure.
That's fine.
Intern is intern.
Intern, yeah.
And then basically they get, instead of registrar, they use the term resident.
Right. Yep.
I'm not really sure what they call the residents.
Right.
And in the UK, they have house officers.
As registrars?
I think house officers are residents and senior house officers, so SHOs are registrars, but don't quote me on that.
That's fine.
But yeah, everybody calls them all sort of slightly different things.
Okay, so basically it's different. So don't assume it's the same somewhere else. I guess it's like your college / university titles in Australia will just say first, second, third, or final year.
Yeah, and like high school in America is different to high school in Australia.
Correct.
And
and you got freshmen as sophomores, and I don't know where else there is.
Yes, sophomores.
Yes, I can't even say it properly. But maybe I'll get the lowdown on that off. In the near future, I might clarify that soon, actually. But okay, moving off that. So, right. So I think we're getting a vague idea of what you do. I think it's still predominantly what we're seeing on television as opposed to what it's really like. So, I mean, could you go through like what a typical day is like for you? Like
Okay.
just a basic day? Like, so what are your hours like? I understand it's sort of shift work.
Yeah, emergency departments always shift work because, emergency departments don't close. So, the way that it works is that at any time of the day, you can come and there will be doctors in an emergency department, except in rural places. So obviously, if some rural emergency departments don't actually have doctors, they're staffed by nurses, and some places are staffed by doctors for a period of time during the day and have doctors on call. And not every emergency department is necessarily staffed by emergency specialists. So if you were to go to some very remote areas, the emergency department might be staffed by the local GPs. So they will work a roster and work in the emergency as well. So it doesn't necessarily mean that because you've come to emergency, you're going to meet emergency specialists. In Sydney, the way that it works is that there are registrar level people, so whether that's career medical officer or registrar, 24 hours a day in any Sydney emergency department, along with residents and interns, and that during the daytime, to varying degrees of coverage, there's actually an emergency specialist around. And usually the whole department is actually run by a director who is an emergency specialist. Yeah. But for example, a shift is usually a 10-hour shift. So it will be broken up into people who are starting at, say, 8 o'clock in the morning and going home at 6. And then there'll be other people who start at 12 at noon and then go home at 10. Other people who start at 2 p.m. in the afternoon and then go till midnight. And then the night staff will start something around 10 or 11 and then go until the morning staff come on.
Right. Okay. Do you have a favourite shift?
Not nights.
Not the graveyard shift, right. Okay, because the thing is, we also hear about those doctors who are on like crazy long shifts, like 24, 36-hour shifts.
Yeah.
Does that happen?
They're on calls. So yes, there are some crazy on-call requirements for some specialties, but it's not what it used to be. So there's been lots of change in recent years to try and get it to a safe and healthy sort of limit for the doctors, and for anyone who's doing shift work, really, because you don't particularly want someone who hasn't slept in 2 days to be,
exactly.
Looking after you.
So when you say in recent years, like, are we talking about last sort of 5 years, 2 years, 10 years?
I'd say probably in the last 10 years or so.
Right.
Certainly while I've been working, it's been much more, and I've been working for 10 years, it's been much more reasonable. And, I hear my senior colleagues talking about what it used to be like in the day and that sort of thing. And, nothing like that.
Okay, good. So there has been change. There's been much more reason being put into. Yeah. But I guess the long shifts was also probably due to short-staffedness. Yeah,
and also I think emergency is probably protected a little bit from that because we know we have to staff the emergency department 24 hours a day. I think, for example, other specialties where they might not actually be needed the entire 24 hours, but need to be available. So, for example, a cardiologist. So if someone has a heart attack in the middle of the night and something needs to happen, there's somebody who's on call who has been, working during the day, sleeping during the night, gets woken up, come in to do something. But now it's not, okay, the next morning you just carry on. There is some, sort of systems in place so that person can go home and get some sleep.
Right. Okay, so for yourself, in one of the Sydney hospitals that you're working at, what is a typical day? Let's say, to keep it simple, you're on the standard shift, 8 a.m. to 6 p.m.
Yep.
So you rock up to hospital at 8 a.m. and sort of what's your typical day sort of look like?
So the first thing would be to take handover. So one thing about emergency is that there's a lot of handing over because the shifts keep changing, and so different people need to look after whoever's left in the emergency department. So all the patients who are in the department, the night staff will give us all the information from what's happened and what the plan is for each of the patients. So doing a handover with them and then going and checking on the situation of each of those patients, as well as for now, because I've become actually the specialist, it's supervision of the registrars, residents, interns, so the trainees and the junior doctors who are in the department. So for me, I'm finding at the moment that it's a lot of not actually necessarily seeing a lot of patients myself. It's helping the others see the patients.
Right. And how long have you been in the supervision role?
So as you become more senior, you do some degree of supervision.
Oh, of course, right.
As you go on. But in terms of being the actually having achieved my specialty, I've only been for a couple of months.
Right, yes. No, because I know you have you've been doing a lot of study for those exams. Okay. Right, so you have a handover, and roughly how long does that tend to last?
So generally it's about half an hour or so.
Right.
And then we basically take on whatever leftover jobs there are or things that need to be done so that the night staff can go home in a timely fashion. I think it's one of the things that critical care generally has to do. So critical care being emergency, intensive care, where there's sort of 24 hours need for things to be done, is that you don't stay back to keep doing stuff because it's shift work and you have to be back.
Yes.
So there's a lot of handing over of whatever jobs need to be done or things that need to be looked into.
Right.
And it happened to varying degrees because some things you just you can't hand over. But an understanding that really you do your 10 hours, hand over, go home.
Yep.
And even if it's a bit of a crappy thing that you get left with, you just accept that, that's part of the job.
Yeah, that's right. Because often it's sometimes you might feel sorry to the next person coming on that, giving them, in the corporate world, we'll often call it a hospital pass. I don't know where it comes from. I thought it came from sport, where for those who understand rugby, it's the term hospital pass, I think generally means where you pass it to someone who's just about to get tackled very, very strongly, for want of a better word. But maybe it came from the hospital, where you get handed over an absolute special, so to speak. But it's, I can understand, especially in medicine, like, it's very easy to get attached to your patient, and you probably want to see it through to a certain point. Yep. But really, you got to let go of that and hand it over to your next doctor.
Yep.
Did you find that hard to do, at first, or is it?
Yeah, I think it's something that you actually have to learn how to do. Is a management of yourself within the shift, so that everything that needs to be done is being done in a manner that's safe for everybody. But you're not taking on the world so that everything is half done by the time that you need to leave.
Right. Because I'd imagine a lot, especially anyone who's working in the emergency department got there because they had a genuine desire to help people in that area.
You would hope so.
Yeah, so you'd think there'd be an inclination to want to continue. So do you find it takes a few months or years for doctors to get used to that idea, or is it pretty much strictly enforced and, within a few weeks it's like?
Well, it varies, I think, because not everybody's there because they are interested in doing emergency as their ongoing thing.
Right.
Because the interns rotate through all the different specialties.
Oh, yes.
As do the residents. So they don't necessarily get a choice. And if you are completely not interested, then you're probably not going to spend that much time trying to refine your skills in doing that sort of thing.
Right.
So definitely personality is a big thing of it as well.
Right.
So there'll be, people who are very much want to finish what they started. And there are other people who have no qualms in passing over anything.
We'll do the bare minimum before they hand it off. Right,
as in any job.
Of course. So you mentioned, I know we're digressing here a little bit, but I think this one's important. So you mentioned interns and residents do a rotation.
Yes.
Sort of, I'm assuming that's through the different areas within the hospital. How many sort of areas, or do they go through all of the?
No, definitely not all. Basically, there's a minimum amount of each intern has to do emergency once, at least.
Right.
And then you have to do at least one medicine and one surgical term.
One medical, and what's the difference? Sorry.
So the way I kind of describe it to my non-medical friends is that there's a surgical specialty. So specialties are divided into medicine, surgery, critical care. So critical care involves intensive care, emergency, anesthetics.
Yep.
That sort of thing. There's surgical stuff, which basically means that someone takes a scalpel and cuts you open. And then there's medical stuff, which there's no scalpel involved.
Right.
It's not 100% accurate, but that's the simplest way to sort of describe it.
What's an example of medical care? I think surgical care is pretty clear. Yeah. Medical care.
So medical care, for example, cardiology is medical. Neurology, so if someone has a stroke, that's medical.
So, but cardiology, if there's open heart surgery.
Yes, then the cardiothoracic surgeons do the surgery part of things,
And they're in the surgical.
Yes, in the surgical half of the world.
Oh, there you go. That I did not know. And then critical care is like intensive care and anesthetics. Okay. All right.
Oh, and then there's the kind of weird and wonderfuls, which I don't really know where to stick them, like psychiatry, for example, which is a little bit not either.
Right, a bit grey.
Yep.
Right, not that you would do surgery for psychiatry.
Yeah, but it's not really considered medical.
As in the old traditional
mind. Yeah,
right,
so they're a little bit outside.
It's difficult to classify. Now, do the interns get to choose which areas they can rotate through other than the compulsory ones?
They can, depending on the different hospitals that they end up, they can make requests, but they can't really determine it because it's basically there's more specialties than you can do in a year. So an intern will do a 5-term rotation. So you will only experience 5 specialties.
Ah, right. And are their requests generally heeded?
Totally depends on the hospital and the medical admin unit that's looking after them.
Right.
Generally, I would say no.
Of course, because I guess it's all based on demand of the hospital.
Yeah,
so.
and they do have to, fill the slots. So if there is a specialty no one wants to do it, they still need staff in that team. So.
Right. So if, let's say, for example, interns done their 5 and the one that they were really passionate about, really wanted to do, let's say it was pediatrics, but they didn't get it.
Yep.
What happens? Can they go through another rotation or?
Yeah, so during their next years, during being a resident, they will request it again. And then if after that they haven't gained the experience that they want, what happens after that is that as a senior resident, there are lots of positions that are much more specific. So you can become a pediatric senior resident and go work, for example, at the children's hospital, and that would mean that you are seeing kids all year round. Or if you had a special interest in surgery, it could be a surgical.
Right. So it's not too much of a concern if you don't get it in the early years. But it would be advantageous, I'm guessing?
Definitely. I think some people go into internship knowing exactly what they want to do. But, for example, me, I didn't know which specialty I wanted to do. So, in a way, what you experience during those first couple of years working helps you to decide what you want to do.
Wow.
As well. So,
wow. Wow. All right, I'm going to come back to this. This whole, see that period, that first 2 or 3 period, for me, I'm really curious about that because I couldn't imagine the amount of pressure that would be on the doctors to do what they have to do.
It is a tough year. Yeah.
Right, but we'll come to that. I just want to come back to the typical day for you. So no, you're right. So the first half hour-ish is handover from the previous shift. Yep. And what happens after that?
So what I generally tend to do is then make sure that the day staff have allocated work. So whether that be following up on things that on things for the patients who the night staff have seen, or seeing new patients, whilst do a round and go see all the patients, make sure that they're all stable and things are done for them.
So this is you under as your supervision sort of type of role.
Yeah. Right. So usually this round is done with the senior nurse manager, whoever is whatever that is called in that hospital.
Yep.
So usually each ward has what we call a NUM, nursing unit manager.
Oh, okay.
So that's basically the head honcho amongst the nurses. And so the head honcho of the nurses and the head honcho of the doctors will usually do a round together to make sure that everything that's supposed to be done for each patient is being done. And then it's going to be it varies a little bit depending on what shift I'm doing and where I am, but then it will be a matter of seeing patients myself, speaking with the senior doctors about the patients they've seen and discussing what plans we need to enact for them, and reviewing together with the junior doctors the patients that they have seen. So the more senior staff who are senior registrars, I wouldn't necessarily go and re-examine all the patients that they've seen, because I know that their skill level and that I can just trust their assessment. But the junior doctors are still learning. So basically it's part of my job to go and assess patients myself and make sure that we formulate between the junior doctor and myself a plan that is appropriate for the patient.
When you're talking junior doctors, you're talking interns and residents generally. So do they already have they already been reviewed by one of the registrars before they see you, or not necessarily?
No.
Right.
So we have an unspoken rule, unwritten rule, I should say, in the ED that if you speak to one senior about a patient, then you continue to speak to that senior. This tends to be because, unlike what people may think about medicine being a science, it is also a bit of an art.
Of course, yes.
So if you end up speaking to too many people, then it just all goes awry. So, if there's more than one senior, then you just end up getting just one senior to help you with them and pick a class together.
Because then you get varying opinions and you'll just get very confused. Which sort of reminds me of, what's that? What was that, that American series? That doctor, the whole series was about the doctor would try to it always would be around diagnosing a particular quirky or strange.
House.
House. So I guess it's that type of thing where if it's a little bit complicated, it can go sort of any which way.
So, I mean, basically the role that emergency has is stabilizing and the sick patients, initializing treatment, but also kind of is a broader triage for the rest of the hospital.
Right.
So trying to figure out which specialty is best to continue looking after the patient. So, I don't really know if House is reflective of how American hospitals really work.
I was going to ask,
Yeah. I've only ever really seen one episode of it.
Right.
And I stopped watching because in the episode they had a whiteboard and they had written intracranial hemorrhage, which means bleeding between two heads. And I thought, I don't think I'll be watching this anymore.
Okay, all right.
Anyway, that's
gotcha.
a side note.
No, understood. For someone who's actually educated in the field, then that makes sense. Right. Okay. So you've done your handover. You've done your reviewing, I guess, of the work allocation. You've done your rounds.
Yep.
You've discussed the diagnoses with the junior doctors. Sort of does that then are you around lunchtime or sort of?
So throughout the day until the next handover, that's generally going to be my role.
Right. Gotcha.
But there's also the just the general flow of how the emergency department is running. So being that it's kind of the front door to the hospital,
right,
you kind of have to make sure that people are moving in and out of it in a timely fashion so that, you don't end up with a huge backlog of people waiting to be seen. As well as making sure that obviously anyone who is very sick and needs to get somewhere quickly is getting there quickly. So one of the things that has been a bit of an issue that I'm sure has come up a lot even for the people who don't work in hospitals through the paper and such is this time rule. So in an effort to measure the effectiveness of the emergency department, there have been sort of these KPIs brought in where if someone presents to the hospital that they need to be worked up and figured out where they need to be, whether that's to go home or come into the hospital or be transferred somewhere else, and then exiting the emergency department by a certain time. And so that has put a focus on the thoroughfare of everybody that comes through. And in varying degrees in different hospitals through Sydney, you will find we get what we call bed block, where you have patients who need to be in the hospital for varying reasons, but there's no actual beds, physical beds that they can go to in the hospital, so they get stuck in the emergency department.
Right.
And so that obviously causes a bit of a problem as then other people who are coming to the hospital can't come into the emergency department.
Right.
So these time KPIs were brought in to help sort of highlight this fact and to bring solutions about how to actually solve this problem. Sydney is a growing population, so as the years go by, every hospital is seeing more and more patients. So bed block is becoming more and more of an issue. So it's been a real focus, at least definitely in the last 5 years, of the health service trying to find ways to sort of get around this and fix this problem.
Yikes! Now, okay, so I've got a couple of questions about this. So KPIs, that word? That word.
You're getting corporate shivers?
No, it rings various bells for different people in different ways, of course. Has the time rule been a help or a hindrance for the day-to-day operations for you, in your opinion?
Well, a bit of both. I think it's definitely helped for it to be seen as more of a hospitals-wide issue rather than something that's just happening in the emergency department and the emergency department needs to fix it. So the rest of it, the hospital is becoming involved in finding the solution to help kids moving and that sort of thing. In the day-to-day thing, the transition was very difficult. So it's, I mean, as much as any job if you were doing a certain job and then suddenly someone with a stopwatch was looking over your shoulder, it's not going to be particularly pleasant. In the same way, transition to having time as a focus where there were people who were literally walking around with, clipboards, marking, this person's nearly at the time. What are we going to do? That sort of thing. Yeah, it was a difficult process because I think depending on where you were, it worked to varying degrees. So there are places where it was great, where we're getting through and getting the patients to where they need to be in time, and it was kind of a reinforcement of this is working. And other places where you just felt unappreciated because you're working very hard, but there's somebody standing over you with a stopwatch.
And now this is for the public hospital system, yeah?
Yes.
So who get funding from the government.
Yes.
So the consequence of a bad performing hospital, if they're not meeting their KPIs, that is not turning over X percentage of patients within the specified time requirements. What's the consequence? Does it mean you get less funding from the government? Like, who cares if you don't meet the KPIs? Everyone's trying to work hard.
I know initially when it came out that funding was attached to it. And then some of the rules have changed. So I'm not 100% sure on how the funding is attached to it now. But I think one of the things is that because different countries work in different ways. So in Australia, there aren't very many emergency departments that are not public hospitals. In Sydney, there's only one, for example.
Which one's that?
Sydney Adventist.
Okay.
Has a private emergency department. It's a private hospital. And so the majority, bar that one emergency department, the rest of the population is going through a public hospital system. So I think, as opposed to countries where a lot of people are going through emergency departments through private hospitals, it's really the burden is on the government to fix the problem because they're the ones who are controlling all the hospitals and the funding and everything. So it's one of those things where, if you performed well, if it was just like the corporate world, it'd be great. You perform well, you get a bonus, fantastic. But it doesn't quite work that way because if you are not performing and then you give less money to that service, then how are they going to improve?
Right, because, initially it was sounding like these KPIs were introduced, now I'm just guessing here, to highlight where there are
issues.
Deficiencies, like not enough beds, and hence the government could divert funds that way. But I guess that may have evolved into you need to fix up your processes or something.
Yeah, I think definitely the purpose was to highlight where the issues are. The processes that needed to change, basically the way that the hospital functioned had to completely change. So it's still an ongoing thing. So of the way that, referrals are made throughout the hospital, with the way that priorities are set in terms of who gets the beds and that sort of thing.
Yeah, no doubt that's super controversial, depending on where you're looking at it from. I can see so many arguments being made for each side. Yeah. But I guess with the bed block situation, okay, there's no beds. You've got 3 patients who really need a bed. What happens?
So they'll continue to get their treatment in the emergency bed.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah. Right.
So it's not like, they're in the corridor.
Yeah.
It just means that we have less space in the emergency for new patients who are coming in.
Right. And you could get in this situation where you don't have enough beds even in the emergency department.
Yeah. That's the worry, I think, that all this stuff has been brought in to try and prevent it from ending up that way. Yeah.
Have you guys hit that problem before, having no beds in the
there's certainly been times where there's a lot of the beds within the emergency department are taken up by patients who are already admitted, and we're running out of places to see people. But it's never gotten. I'm pretty sure that in Sydney it's never gotten to a point where there's not a single space.
How many beds do we have in the ED department in one of the big hospitals? Is it 10, 50?
So it's hard to answer because there's different sections.
Oh.
So as you know, for example, there'll be a section where everybody's in a bed, whereas there might be a what some hospitals called minors or subacute or whatever it is, where these are ambulant people, so they might be in chairs.
Right.
So one of the big hospitals, if I count it up, I think it's probably about 30 actual physical beds for people to lay in.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, just to sort of put some context around the number of beds we're talking
about. But, smaller hospitals will have less. So a small hospital may only have 6 beds for people to lay in. So, yeah, it just varies on the size of the ED.
Okay, so for yourself as a supervisor, you sort of gone through what you sort of do on a day-to-day basis. Obviously, that's in a more supervisory role. When did you, obviously you've got your formal qualification for that I don't know what you call it, but you were already you already had that specialty before you passed your latest exams.
Yeah. So I think that's probably a concept that just doesn't get advertised to the non-medical community, because why would they want to know?
That's okay. That's okay.
But basically, you're a doctor as soon as you graduate, and when you're a trainee, so you are in that specialty, but you're a trainee in that specialty, not a training doctor. So you're already a doctor, but you are a training specialist.
And when did you end up in the working more formally in the emergency department?
So I did internship, residency, and then went straight into emergency after that.
Oh, right, because you felt that was where you wanted to go. Right. So, because the reason I ask is, if you step back a few years, what would your typical day would have looked like as a doctor actively seeing patients as opposed to a supervisory role?
Oh, yeah. So I guess the most hands-on yet autonomous role that you have is as a registrar.
Right.
So because as you become more senior as a registrar, you are gaining all the skills that you need, and you're gaining certainly the experience. When a particularly sick person comes in, it tends to be the registrars that will take over looking after them, because they don't have to step back in terms of running the department. So a typical day as a registrar would be everybody tends to attend the handovers, so you may be allocated a patient that the night staff had seen to look after. Otherwise, you pick up patients as they come, and because of the triage system, different EDs work in a way where if you're in the, for example, acute area, you might be seeing everybody who needs a bed. They're sick enough that they need a bed. Whereas if you're in the subacute area, you might be seeing like a lot of patients, but who don't have as serious a problem. So you might see someone who broke their arm, put a plaster on, sort out where they need to go to have that fixed, and then next person.
Actually, I've always been curious. Is there, because the term emergency is so subjective, right? So you'll have all sorts of problems coming in. The first thought would be, okay, emergency should generally mean life-threatening, right?
You would think so.
Right. But that's it. So I think I heard broken arm in there.
Yeah.
So to us, if I broke my arm, I'm like, crap, this is really serious. I better go to emergency.
Yes.
But then if you stop and thinking about it, actually, I'm not going to die because I broke my arm. I can really probably go to the doctor tomorrow or the day after. But I
wouldn't advise. But
right. We're not going to go into specifics as to why, but is there, do you get particular patients who are like, okay, this is not an emergency? Do you tell them to go home and go to your GP, the family doctor tomorrow, or do you still treat them?
Generally, yes, that is a common gripe among any level of doctor that is working in the emergency department, is that people's definition of emergency is very widely different. So there are people who will be half dead but want to still go to work.
Right, yes.
And we will be like, for the love of God, you are going to die. Will you please stay in hospital? And there are some people who will have a paper cut and come to the emergency department.
That's an exaggeration, right?
Yes, that's an exaggeration. But that's why the triage system exists.
Of course, right.
So if the triage nurse sees that you're having a heart attack, then you will be seen before people who may have arrived before you, who have less serious injuries.
Of course.
So like you said, yes, you've broken your arm, but you're not going to die immediately. So if someone came in after you and was actively having a heart attack, they would be seen before you.
Right.
That's the way that the emergency department works.
Yep.
But there is, as the categories go down, lesser acuities. So, I mean, there's definitely things that I don't think that people need to come to the emergency department for, nor call an ambulance for. But I do realise that I have the benefit of knowing what comes through the emergency department. But our general thought is that, you know, if it's something that you could have gone to see your GP with, if there's a GP that's actually attached to the hospital, so some emergency departments have a GP unit that they're associated with. So it's funded by the hospital, but there's a general practitioner there. We can divert them to the general practitioner. But in hospitals where that's not the case, then they get triaged. They get told that they are you know, a low priority, and anyone who's sicker is going to get seen before them, and they get seen through the emergency department. And if I find that they have a problem that really isn't an emergency, then I'll tell them and I'll say, look, next time this happens, just go see your general practitioner.
Yeah.
This isn't something to come to the emergency department about.
Right.
But, you know, we still see them.
All right, cool. So for those listening in Australia, because I realised when I was overseas that the word general practitioner seems to be quite specific to Australia, I think, or a lot of countries don't use that phrase. So the equivalent would be family doctor. Yeah. GP is general practitioner, which is your family doctor, which is one of the specialties. Yeah. Man, I'm getting good at this. All right, okay. Now, I've been I'll close this off soon with some other questions, but there's been this question I've been itching to ask from the beginning, and I've told myself I'll wait to the end, but I'm not going to anymore. And it's the morbid side of me that kicks in. I'm sure many of us it's probably the first question we'd normally ask in a casual sort of social scene. You got to tell us some what are some of the most crazy things you've seen in ED? So here's the morbid side kicking. Like, surely you've seen some pretty funky stuff.
Well, I can't go into specifics due to confidentiality laws.
Okay. Yes.
Okay. But in general, I've seen people who've been shot, who've been stabbed. I do the helicopter job, and so I've been to sort of accident scenes and that sort of thing. I think, you know, the things that surprise me are not so much the serious stuff. I think the things that surprise me are just the things that you wouldn't think. So people who go up ladders to clean their gutters or something and then fall over and have horrendous injuries.
Right.
So everyday sort of stuff. So, I mean, heaven knows, you know, everybody, you know, has access to ladders.
Yes.
Right? You can just go to the hardware store and buy it.
Correct.
But, you know, and you can't license everybody who owns a ladder.
That's a
but
good
you
point.
would be really surprised at how much pretty serious injury can happen with everyday stuff.
All right. And so you got ladders. What are some other things?
So I've seen more than one person who just by the slip of the mind and not really 100% focusing was mowing the lawn, and then something got stuck in the motor blades and they put their hand in.
No.
Yeah. It's just because they were so occupied with what they're doing. And went, it's stuck in there, and they stuck their hand in there, and then,
All right. So random stuff like that.
Yeah, but with everyday things. Wow. So, yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay. So you're not going to go into the details of your shootings and stabbings and whatever. Does any of that stuff make it hard for you to go to bed at night?
Sometimes, yeah, definitely. I think as you get more experience in the field of medicine in general, no matter what specialty you do, you get thicker skin. But, you know, I can still vividly recall the first time I had to explain to family that, somebody had died.
Right, of course. Yes.
And being in the emergency department, it's not necessarily like, for example, if you happen to do work in the cancer centre where people know their diagnosis and have some idea that they are sick.
Yes.
Sometimes you will see people who were either perfectly fine and had no idea they were sick and who have had terrible things happen to them. And I think more than seeing the actual sickness, it's dealing with the emotional response. That's kind of the thing that lingers with you.
Right, of course.
Because a lot of the time it's not actually the patient that you're dealing with, it's the family members. Yeah.
Right. Okay. I can't imagine. I mean, with all your experience now, obviously you would still have to continue passing on that information. Does it, now I don't mean to by any means, downgrade the severity of the situation, but does it become, I'm going to use the word, much more manageable? I don't want to use the word
definitely.
easier.
No, definitely. I mean, because I think as you have to do it more, your mind kind of learns to compartmentalize.
Right.
And go, look, this is part of the job. And that it is basically, a part of life.
Yeah.
People are going to get sick, things are going to happen. And it's my job to actually, explain it to people. I think obviously it's, there are always going to be times when someone reminds you of someone or a situation that you've been in, and it's definitely harder than, other times. But I think one of the things that you get good at is not only just having to deal with that sort of stuff, but if you want longevity in doing this job, that you need to learn how to debrief it. So even if it's not formally, but to speak with your colleagues or whatever, or, your partner or whoever is appropriate, to kind of vent it, and so that you don't keep it all kind of bottled up to yourself.
Yeah. But the thing is, okay, and that's, it's funny because Dennis, the episode 1 participant, mentioned something very similar. Now, when you debrief or when you get it out of your system, do you talk about the specifics of it, or is it more just the emotions? Like, is it, there was a situation today and I had to do this and this and this and this and this?
Yeah.
And is it just the fact that you can tell someone what happened? Is that enough? Or is it more, oh, damn, this happened and I'm feeling like this and I don't know,
I think it depends on the situation, because being that it's I think some people call it that some doctors have a God complex sort of thing. But I guess...
Sorry, what do you mean by God complex?
So that, you're in control.
Right. Okay.
And...
sort of like a self-denial sort of thing. I'm okay, or...
Well, no, I meant more like when you're looking after the patient, I think if it was unexpected, there's certain debriefing that at least I certainly feel I need to do with my colleagues about going through it and, reassuring myself that everything that could have been done has been done.
Yeah.
And that, and to just sort of air out that, there wasn't anything more we could do. And, take whatever lessons we need to take from that.
Yeah.
And that kind of debriefing, you need to do with a colleague who understands the way that, medicine works. But I think, for example, the first time I had to tell a family member, I wasn't really worried about the actual resuscitation situation of the patient, because it was quite obvious that there was nothing we could do. But, I found that I debriefed with my friends, because it was a very big emotional toll on me, that it was the first time I actually had to be the person who sat down with, the patient's wife and whatever, and tell them what happened.
And I'm guessing a doctor wouldn't be put in that position until they're at a registrar level, or can it be anywhere in the spectrum?
Well, you can't really predict.
Right.
It's
just whoever's there, whoever's generally the most senior, or just...
Generally, the way that it's supposed to work, obviously, is that the most senior person should have that conversation. Because it's not just a matter of experience, but also out of respect for the family, that the person who's best able to answer all the questions that they have is the person who tells them the information. And also, I think, because, for example, the first time I had to tell someone, it was during night shift. I was actually a registrar, but I was the most senior person around doctor-wise. So that, it was my job, irrespective of whether I'd seen the patient or not. Yeah.
Wow. Okay, wow, that's pretty full on. Obviously, being a doctor is no small feat by any means. So, no, thank you very much for that. So that's. I guess it's a lot of stuff that a lot of the younger generation don't really think about potentially before they sort of decide maybe I want to be a doctor. Yeah. But we can get to that. I guess so to change the mood a bit. So you've got you got your typical days and you got your good days, your bad days, your average days. Generally, what will make your day a good day? You'll sort of get off your shift and say, yeah, that was a good day. Or do you have any of those?
Yeah, I think.
And what would make it a relatively good day?
Okay. A good day.
Oh, sorry guys. That's it for episode 3. That was some heavy stuff towards the end there, but I think still very interesting and very enlightening as well. Now, as you heard right at the end, we do move on to happier stuff. So if you want to end on a bright note, jump on to the next episode. Also, if you've been enjoying the episodes and you'd love to support the show, there is a way. You can become a patron via patreon.com. That is patreon.com. And you can find us by searching for We Work, Rest and Play, all one word, from the Patreon homepage. You'll gain a bunch of exclusive access and benefits, so definitely worth checking out. Every little bit of support is a huge help and goes a very long way in keeping this show alive. And of course, thank you very much for listening. Don't forget to follow or subscribe to the podcast to make sure you automatically receive new episodes. And if and when you feel like it, it would be great if you could spend just a few seconds to leave a review to let me know what you think about the show. You can also refer to the website weworkrestandplay.com for the show notes. And we shall continue talking work with Sunny in the next episode. And so until then, live life, take care, and keep smiling. The intro and outro music is an extract from the track entitled Falling Down by the artist named Ryan Little and is used in accordance with the Creative Commons Attribution License. Thank you very much, Ryan. Further references can also be found in the show notes at www.weworkrestandplay.com.